Hello, and welcome to Secure AF Podcast.
Welcome.
A podcast created by the Alias team and the man behind the magic over here, Todd. Say hi, Todd. He doesn't want to say hi.
He doesn't want to speak.
That's fair. Yeah, he's going to put me up here, but okay. This is my second time being on the podcast now. First time I think I talked about Sims. It's been a while, a couple of years now.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of being on things like this, so it's probably one you don't see much of me. We had one topic we wanted to talk about today, and that was centered around firewalls and the part they play forensically and preventively for IRs and things like that. So I think today that's what we're going to talk about is firewalls.
You want to start from the beginning?
Firewalls. Yeah, I don't know what the beginning is.
What is a firewall?
Firewall, it is a piece of hardware in your network, typically at the edge between you and your internet, that helps filter and control traffic coming in and out. It is a critical piece of hardware. For some reason, it's often looked over.
Right. When it comes to, like, I guess, basic network configuration, especially like for just like everyday people in their home, usually like they would have a router from their internet service provider, right? Technically, wouldn't that operate or function similarly to a firewall?
Yeah, some of them do have that capability.
Yeah.
A lot of the times that type of traffic is kind of handled by your, not necessarily your ISP, but since you have just, a singular device that's acting as a gateway for, a laptop or a desktop.
Right.
There's not a lot of need for control of that traffic. A lot of the times you can go in if you have like a modem router combo is the most common one. Where you can set up a wireless SSID and you can connect to it, and then you may have a hardwire Ethernet connection from your desktop up to it.
Right.
And a lot of those devices have firewalling functionality. You can go log into them and take a look at it, and there might be some basic firewalling and those type of things. Maybe, what ports are open on it.
Right.
Are there any ports that we see that are blocked or dropped and things like that? And so once you get into the enterprise workspace, you just see more enterprise functionality.
Why is that, though?
It's just it needs, it depends on the size of the network.
Yeah.
Security specifically.
Okay.
I say this a lot just to kind of help people who might be somewhat familiar with networking itself or network security, but not super familiar with the ins and outs of firewalls. Is a firewall is mainly the main functionality of it would be a hardware ACL. Is to think of it that way.
Now, for people who don't know what an ACL is.
Fair. ACL is access control list.
Gotcha.
It is a configuration that most switches are capable of nowadays, where you basically just set a rule that reads from the top down.
Gotcha.
And that'll say, it might be something as simple as an extended ACL that says, hey, if you are this IP address on this subnet, you're allowed anywhere. Or you might lock that down to, hey, if you're this IP address on this subnet, you can go to this specific other IP, but nothing else.
So similar, it's more so like a, kind of like an address book.
Yeah, similar. It well, maybe not an address book, but more of a rule set of, who you can call.
Gotcha.
Is a way to think about it. You might have an address book, which would be maybe like an ARP table or a MAC table or something like that.
So if I had my cell phone and I had a block list.
Yeah, 100%.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that'd be a better way to think about it, yeah. And the important thing to note about ACLs and firewalls is, except for a couple, there's one weird brand out there, I can't remember whatever it is, but there's an implicit deny.
Okay.
So implicit deny, which again is the most important part of the ACLs or firewalls themselves, is that if you are not configuring your firewall to allow traffic through, it is going to be denied by default.
Okay, gotcha.
And that is by design. And so, and that's part of one of the reasons why I think it's looked over is a lot of the times where, and it really just varies. It depends on who's setting up the firewalls, who's managing the firewalls. A lot of the times, if you're unfamiliar with it, someone might come in and say, hey, we just need this to work.
Gotcha.
And go in and set up hey, if you're on this interface, you can go anywhere, any servers, any. And that's typically what we see that causes most of the issues, where there's no control over that traffic.
Speaking of issues, I mean, granted, like I know that we've pretty much have engaged on quite a bit of incident response engagements together.
Yeah.
What type of misconfigurations based on these rule sets, these ACL lists, and so forth, have you seen that have been more common than not that may have been the root cause to a compromise or a breach?
Well, it really varies. The any rule that we were just talking about being at the top of a list, or really just in a list, tends to be the most detrimental, and one that we've seen several times now.
Gotcha. Where
it really looks like someone who wasn't familiar with the technology or how it worked.
Okay.
Went in, they were put in charge for whatever reason of trying to get something to work, and they figured out, like, hey, let me test this out and see if can I allow this traffic to this destination, and it works, and they leave it alone and not realize that you may have just opened yourself up to something. And I think that's kind of been one of the most common things that we've seen on IRs, is where we go into an IR, they have a firewall, but no one really manages it, right? They don't have like a dedicated firewall person, and it seems like it's rare nowadays that they have like even a dedicated network engineer.
Well, why is that so important to have a dedicated person to, I guess, like monitor and manage the firewall?
Well, just to go beyond, visibility into the traffic, is who's patching. What's your firmware? Who's doing firmware updates? Who's checking for CVEs on these? Right. And we see, regardless of brand of firewall, whether they're FortiGates or Palos or WatchGuards or anything like that, CVEs are going to pop up. Right. The threat actors are out there 24/7 poking and prodding and trying to develop these attacks to bypass the firewalls. Yeah. And that regardless of the configuration of your firewall, for the most part, if a 0-day drops on a firewall and there's a vulnerability, that it doesn't matter whether your configuration is rock solid. If there's a problem with the code in it, who's monitoring that? And you can say, well, our sysadmin might monitor that, or our IT director is monitoring it. But what other, or trying to think of a way to word this, like, there people in those types of positions where you're like the director, you're overseeing so many different departments. Right. What else are you trying to keep an eye on? It's just like, having an IT help desk admin.
And it sounds like what it sounds like is that a lot of teams, especially administration teams in IT, they're already wearing multiple hats, juggling a multitude of different tasks, so they may not have the capacity to just dedicate themselves to understanding and managing and monitoring that firewall configuration and so forth.
I think that's been our experience. Yeah.
What I find also fascinating is, like, when it comes to like smaller organizations who may not specialize or even operate in IT, so they have to outsource that. What their budget looks like in terms of like upgrading their firewall systems, because of course we've both seen it to where an incident occurs or a breach happened and we had to respond to where the firewalls were just pretty much outdated. They were at their end of life. They were at their end of life, and so that was the cause of that compromise.
And you've been there with us. That, like, well, one of the first things I ask when we hop on a call, for an IR, talking to customers and stuff, figuring out like what kind of firewalls you have, who manages them, the list of questions that I ask. Where's your syslog? Where's it logged to? Where are you collecting it?
Even if just collecting logs in general.
Yeah.
I know one incident specifically that you're referring to where they had firewalls. They seemed to be up to date, and they thought they would receiving logs, but the configuration wasn't set or enabled.
Correct. Yeah, it was kind of disappointing. They had an external tool that was part of that suite of products that they used.
Right.
And they had a license. It was all set up. And then it turns out the logging on the firewall was only set to log DNS traffic. And that was it. And, there's just nothing you can do about that at that point. Once those logs are gone, they're gone. And so most of those firewalls you might get lucky and get maybe 24 hours of logs on them, depending on how much space they have internally. But without some kind of like syslog setup or, a SIM, anything like that, FortiGates have FortiAnalyzer and things like that you can utilize to dump off to with something with much larger storage. It just turns into we don't know what we don't know stuff.
That's true.
We can't, unfortunately go in and figure out forensically what those logs look like at that point in time, especially when we have incidents where the threat actor may have been in for months.
Right.
And I think we've run into more and more of that here recently as well.
Based on that, I mean, would you say that the logs would kind of help someone who's analyzing them to identify like a threat actor? How they gained access, what they had access to, and so forth.
Absolutely. I mean, in the past, where we assisted customers on IRs that had logs, within that first day, we were able to determine how much data was taken and where they took it from, and most likely what that data was. And then with continued forensic examination on that server, we were able to determine what that data was.
Gotcha.
And that was within a couple days.
So performing a digital image of the server, being able to analyze the image itself and then correlate that to the firewall logs, you're able to identify, okay, this is how the threat actor gained access, this is what they had access to, and then with correlation of the investigation of the image, then identify what data was actually...
Exactly, yeah. And that's kind of, that's the best case scenario, right? Is that we have those logs and that forensic analysis and that investigation just goes smoothly. And we can get that data and we can provide it to, the customer, lawyers, their lawyers, whoever it is that we need to. We can put those things in a report and feel very confident about what had happened, how long ago it took place, what may have been affected, what data may have been touched, things like that.
Right.
And then, but again, flip that to say we don't have any logs at all, well, then it all becomes a best guess. And then we're relying solely on the forensic analysis of the machines in question, if you know which all machines those are.
Gotcha.
And so, but, I'm sure Peters has been in here talking about forensics and stuff too, and you guys might be familiar with Andrew Peters, our forensic expert here, but... part of the common complaints that we have, let's talk about what can go wrong. You don't have logs on the firewalls.
Okay.
All right. We get to the server in question and it's been rebooted.
Or it's been disconnected from the network and shut down. Right.
Yeah. A host of things, and that could be the same for the firewall. We've seen that as well, where unfortunately we've gotten on site and someone's powered down the firewall, and it happens a lot. They just don't know what else to do. It's grasping for straws, trying to figure out, okay, we know we're under attack or someone has got in. What do we do? Well, let's shut it down. Let's take the path away. We might be hard down, but at least they can't take any more data or
access anything else within the environment.
When truth be told, they have probably already been in and out. They're probably already done. And so the concern at that point in time isn't necessarily that, they can't take anything else. It's like, is there C2 in the environment somewhere?
Right.
What's persistence look like, if any, has been put in there?
Yeah.
And then, on the other side of that, if you reboot something, then we lose more forensic data, right? So forensically, during, an investigation of an IR, is you shut down a firewall, you lose everything stored in memory. Unless you have something like a syslog doing collection or things like that. And same goes for any kind of server or endpoint that's been hit.
Yeah.
You reboot it, and all that stored memory is gone. All you have is whatever's in the event viewer, for Windows or whatever OS it is. So
the audit logs.
Yeah. And we may be able to glean some information about what tools were utilized or what was installed when, but we're never going to get the full picture on that.
Yeah.
And that just compounds things. And again, it turns into, instead of having a lot of confidence in knowing what happened and when and what all was touched or what wasn't touched or persistence or, that whole host of just plethora of information that we can get, it's then narrowed down to this small window. And so that's why, I harp on syslog a lot, making sure that there is a syslog, it is set up, and what all is being logged, what's going to syslog is, in the instance that, some reason, it loses power or, it gets shut down.
Yeah.
You at least have those logs already, so it's not like, well, we got what we got. It's like, no worries, we got this.
What kind of tools would you say could be used to analyze firewall logs for different types of investigations?
Use a lot of Notepad++. Highly recommend that. Shout out to those guys there. FortiGates are great because there's FortiAnalyzer.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorites. FortiGates are a little bit more, you have to have a little more presence of mind to figure out what you're logging and what you're not logging.
Yeah.
By default, a lot of the times they only log like security events. I prefer having everything if you have the overhead for it.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you see traffic that comes through that's not a security event. It's being allowed through.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily, and that's kind of the funny part about it is that if it was a security event and you had it set up to block it, you might get an alert on it. Cool. And that's great to know that, hey, this might be a potential attack happening. But a lot of the traffic that we see that is malicious, it's not logged as a security event because it's being allowed through.
Yeah.
One specific example would be, when we've seen data exfil to certain websites like Mega Upload. Unless you have like a SIM in place that's
right.
Someone's like, hey, there's like a terabyte of data going up here. This should be looked
it's
at.
Outgoing.
Yeah, if the firewall's not set up to like, hey, don't allow traffic to this, destination or, however you want to set it up. Unless you have something watching that traffic 24/7, or you have some kind of daily report going through, and then by the time you get your daily report, how much has gotten through. So,
what would you consider the basic configurations for setting up a firewall, just for like on a basic level?
Level. Oh, it's difficult. It's all access control. It's figuring out what devices need access to what externally and allowing only that.
Yeah.
That's kind of the basis of what firewalls do. What I like to see for forensically is I like seeing that syslog is set up. We're logging all the traffic in and out.
Okay.
Specifically to like your WAN port, so your traffic going externally. So anything egressing from your environment, and ingress as well. Ingress from the internet.
The outside in.
Yeah, the outside in, externally in. That's always great to see. Helps us forensically. Aside from that, it's mainly just making sure you're only allowing what traffic that you need where, and make sure that you have a separation of what that traffic is, right?
Gotcha.
So you might say like, hey, all of my VoIP phones are on this subnet internally, and then all my desktops are on this subnet internally. But making sure when you're setting up rules that you have rules specifically for those types of devices, so that if you're going through and looking, you can easily identify these VoIP phones only need, access to DNS and this VoIP traffic or SIP or whatever it is.
Gotcha.
These desktops are for end users that only need, HTTPS and email and things like that, and locking them down that way. And it's as simple as once you get an environment set up, if you're working with a team of people who have, on the networking side and on the help desk side, or, whoever's doing what is identifying what are those networks, what do they need access to, bring your firewall up and start figuring out, like, hey, these devices need access to this, set it up that way, test them, cool, you're good. And those are fine. That's the rule you need.
Gotcha.
So
the firewall is like the gatekeeper.
You
need someone to gatekeep the firewall.
Yeah. The gateway, the gatekeeper, and that's, primarily the purpose of firewalls there.
Yeah. In terms of like managing firewall, right? Have you ever had to respond to an incident where default credentials were still set on the firewall?
Once. Yeah, once.
You remember what type of firewall it was?
It was a FortiGate.
It was a FortiGate?
Yeah, it was a FortiGate. That was a while ago. I think it was around when I first started. But it was one of those small business. Someone had come in and set this up for them.
Yeah.
They could access the internet, but really it wasn't set up to be a firewall. It was set up just to be a gateway. Where
Gotcha.
It wasn't really doing any firewalling, you might say. So it was just kind of had a any all rule, and so
it really wasn't even serving its purpose.
No, it wasn't even set up to do logging. It was just kind of an expensive,
piece of hardware.
Kind of an expensive router. Not really doing that. So, but it tends to be more rare.
I feel like most like these NGFWs or next gen firewalls. A lot of those type of firewalls, upon first setup, initial setup, they force the person who's administering that firewall to
change the
password
and stuff. Yeah, I know. I believe FortiGates do that. I'm not sure about Palos. Yeah, I'm sure they do as well. Yeah, it's an initial setup thing that it's good to have in there. You got to change it because that's a problem. And I think they should even go further and don't use the default admin account.
Right.
Set up your own admin account. That's not all lowercase. Make it weird too. Because I think when we're talking about a device that is 100% of the time, most likely, outward facing, on to the external net or to the internet at all times, that's what threat actors go after.
Yeah.
Right. So they see an IP address, your public IP address.
Right.
And they go, okay, I know that's there. How can I get past it?
Yeah.
How can I get through it? And it's just an unfortunate reality is that
first thing they're going to check is default credentials.
Yeah. First thing. And you can, even in our firewall logs, things like any kind of VPN traffic specifically, if you're set up to use a VPN through your firewall, that IP address has to stay public.
Right.
It has to be open so your users can hit it. And so the question is, how hardened is that IP address?
Yeah.
Do you have it shut down specifically to where it's only doing IPsec, or God forbid it's set up to do management. We've seen that before too, where you've got a public IP you've assigned to a WAN port on your firewall, and it's configured to allow HTTPS and SSH and stuff to it. So now threat actors can hit an interface, as well as whatever else they want to on it.
Yeah.
So they know what it is and that it's alive. And then if they know you've got a FortiGate firewall, then they can just check, hey,
see what vulnerabilities exist.
Yeah, can I hit it with any known vulnerabilities?
Yeah.
And that's kind of, one of the ways we've seen a lot of customers get hit through that is not necessarily that, the credentials weren't secure, but because the threat actors were even able to get to an interface and know what it was and then go through a list of CVEs until they figured out, wow, this is a pretty outdated firewall. And they got in through a CVE on it.
Yeah.
And we've seen it. We've seen it. So, and again, kind of talking about, management of the firewalls and what's done with them is monitoring and keeping an eye out for those CVEs is so critical.
Yeah.
I mean,
I agree.
I would argue that just from what I've seen in my experiences, firewalls are some of the hardest hit devices for the reasons that we just stated.
Yeah.
Because they're always out there. Can you get through a firewall? Guys are going to try to hit firewalls and get through them, you know. So
plus they also understand like if they're targeting an organization that's much smaller than those large enterprises, chances are there's going to be some misconfiguration of some sort.
Oh, for sure.
And possibly out of date.
Right. Yeah.
Out of date firmware.
Yeah, unfortunately. And that just comes from, you know, from the start of this conversation is the importance of having someone actually managing those and not just being kind of fly-by-night kind of, you know, did you look at that? Oh, yeah, it's fine. It's fine. No one's yelling.
Is it working?
No one's
it's
screaming.
working.
Yeah, I feel like that's what we see a lot. Is like someone's just like, well, no one's yelling yet, and I've got so many other things to do that I'm just, you know, going to let it ride and not realizing that someone may have been in the environment for 3 months.
Or a year.
For a year.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of those access brokers now are just getting in and then selling access to it. So, you know, and that's things that you could identify if you had someone watching your firewall and your logs, or what are you doing with your logs? You know, and again, it's a vicious cycle of.
Now, I'm just curious for anyone who might be listening, right? Mm-hmm. It may be in a position where they realize that they don't have someone dedicated to monitoring and managing a firewall. What does that specifically look like in terms of, I guess, acquiring a service like that?
Well, you know, there's a lot of options out there. There are some MSPs that do it. There are MSSPs that do it regarding, you know, firewall management. And that's someone that you can call 24/7 that, you know, check firewall, have a schedule, you know, regularly scheduled maintenance window or patch management cycle. People can go and look for those CVEs and at least reach out to you. You know, a lot of the times, someone who provide like firewall management services there are a lot of options out there. You can find there's MSPs that do it, there's MSSPs that do it a lot of the times, and that's, you know, someone that you can just completely hands off on, or someone that you can, you know, partner with to say, hey, we just want you guys to like review our rules and tell us how we can change things, or, you know, what's our firmware at. Having a regular cadence with that is best. Or, you know, if you're a small business and can afford it and you're like, I just need someone else to do this, that's fine too. Like there's a lot of options where, you know, a company like Alias might be able to come in and say, yep, we'll manage this firewall. We'll put it, you know, depending on what type it is. We just need management access to it, whether it's a FortiGate or Palo or, you know, WatchGuard, whatever it is. And then someone like me would just come in and review everything, and we would sit down and talk about the rules and how they existed and what's needed where. You know, keep an eye on any kind of CVEs, notify of any CVEs, plan maintenance windows. We do daily traffic monitoring as well. So for a couple different ways. We're not just relying on one way with that, where we have a daily report that comes through where we can look and see what applications are using the most data, who's, you know, where are the most, you know, attacks being seen from, like what sourcing. And then we highly suggest having SIM services for firewalls. Just because they're, if you're not in them 24/7.
Just for log ingestion, right?
Just for log ingestion. If you can have someone like a SIM provider ingest logs for your firewall, that is such a huge security boon for like IDS stuff. It's just knowing, like, you're going to get an email. You don't have to sit there and watch that firewall all day. You're not just reliant on a daily report either. You have someone that can sit there, watch traffic, you know, a SIM. Most of it's AI, but at least they can give you a heads up, like, hey, there's some really suspicious traffic happening right now, or we see a large chunk of data trying to leave your network. Things like that, and then you can go into reaction mode.
So as opposed to like what you mentioned earlier about how you would investigate or analyze like firewall logs, you would typically just open up the logs in like Notepad++, to manually review them like with a SIM, like a tool like a SIM, right? by ingesting the logs from the firewall, you can pretty much have rules configured in the SIM to notify and alert you of
for specific thresholds.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so it might say like, and it takes a little while for when you're bringing a SIM in to start ingesting firewall logs and figuring out, hey, what's normal traffic, what's not. And so you can say, hey, if we start seeing data from this source leaving, it could be as little as, if you see a gig of data leaving this, that's concerning to us.
Right.
Or it could be, hey, if you see 500 gigs leaving this, it's fine. That's what it's supposed to do, things like this.
Yeah.
And so you can kind of set those thresholds, and really it's a great early warning system is what it is. Highly suggested. It lets you sleep at night knowing that, like, hey, if something happens, there's going to be emails, phone calls, someone's going to be notified that, like, hey, something possibly malicious is going on.
What happens if, let's say, for instance, someone did end up investing into having firewalls implemented into their environment? They also went ahead and utilized a SIM to, I guess, ingest those firewall logs, and they started noticing traffic and receiving alerts that there's traffic from China, Russia, and so forth hitting their firewall trying to get in. Like, is that common at all?
Oh yeah, that's probably the most common thing we see is what's considered suspicious or malicious traffic from odd or malicious geolocations. So, attacks from China, Russia, Ukraine, or some other ones that we see frequently. Norway is a big one too. There's the best option is always geo-blocking. I always recommend figuring out, does your traffic really need to leave the U.S.? If it does, or people need access to that, then it's a case-by-case basis. But a lot of times I geo-block all internal and external to the United States,
Gotcha.
Or U.S., Canada, kind of depending on the functionality of your firewalls. But geo-blocking will help. You're knocking out a huge risk right there. Huge risk right there, just blocking that type of traffic where you're saying, hey, I know for our business, we don't do business anywhere else in the world besides within the United States. Cool. On your firewall, just put geo-blocking. Say, you can send in, you can receive or send, as long as you're that IP you're looking for is within the U.S. And then if not, then it blocks it. Yeah. And so that is absolutely huge,
I feel like most firewalls nowadays have the capability to basically integrate with their own blacklist of like IP ranges.
Yeah, most of the next generation firewall stuff is that's built in. You may have some kind of licensing that's required for you to utilize that functionality, but I know the FortiGates are good with that too, where a lot of that stuff's built in. You may be able to just go in and say, for geo-blocking specifically, that, hey, we know this chunk of IP addresses belong to Russia, and then you just create an address group for those IPs and call it Russia, and then so create, whatever kind of block rules you want to make for that. It's great. But it exists for, any geolocation where you can say, hey, I want to block a whole continent or just a specific country, or hey, I want to block a specific city. You may even be able to get that granular with it. So
I feel like you're a firewall Jedi.
I'm not. I'm really not. I feel like I learn new stuff every day.
Yeah.
I will argue I'm never the smartest person in the room. I've got experience with stuff, and if people listen to it or have questions, I'm happy to talk about my experience and what I know about it. But there are a lot smarter people who work here and probably elsewhere. I'm just kind of, I don't know. I know firewalls and networking, and I enjoy it. It is. It's interesting. I think that's probably one of my favorite parts of my job currently is when we get an IR and I get to jump into a firewall. And,
really?
And sometimes I'm really impressed, and other times I'm just really bummed. But it's great, though. the tech is constantly changing.
Yeah.
You know, for some of those starting out firewalls, you didn't have like the geo blocking and stuff. You know,
really?
You had to go manually configure, you know, those kinds of IPs and figure it out on your own.
What did that look like for you back in the
back
previous
in the day?
Back
in the day. Oh. You know, I didn't. Thankfully.
Let's put it into perspective, into context of perspective. How long have you been working with firewalls?
Firewalls, just about 7 years now.
7 years, gotcha.
Yeah. So, and that ranged from starting out with like the sonic wall devices.
Okay.
And then FortiGates, and then Palos. Some WatchGuards here or there, but yeah, there's some Ubiquity firewalls too that they're fine. It's really, at the end of the day, functionality-wise, they all do the same thing.
Gotcha.
You know, their UI might be different, their CLI might be different, how you manage them might be different, and that's kind of the crux of it, is figuring out, like, you know, if you're managing a firewall, what's the easiest for you? You know, if you're like, FortiGates are super user-friendly, the interface is really nice and simple to follow, cool, go with a FortiGate. If you really want, you know, that super in-depth granular ability for enterprise level, like Palos, like they're all great in their own way. And, you know, I wouldn't really just say there's not just one that I would recommend off the top, but
yeah.
But thankfully, I didn't have to do a lot with any of those early iterations of firewalls. And,
gotcha.
And you know, in talking about like ACLs and stuff, is working with layer 3 switches and ACLs on those, is there's a lot of traffic you can control there too, depending on where the routing is.
Gotcha.
It's kind of rare to see the firewalls acting as the router for an entire environment, because that'll put a load on your firewall.
I feel like the only thing we're missing from this episode is just like one of those clear, dry erase boards.
Oh, man, yeah. I think we'd have room for... Todd would hate that if we put this up right here and just started drawing out network diagrams. Microsoft Paint, too. That's
which is like what I enjoy, especially in the SOC, whenever you have an opportunity to kind of like explain like the functionality of someone's environment and how quickly and easy it is for you to just map out their network just from a conversation you're having with them over the phone.
Right. And that's just from experience too. Like, yeah. I think a lot of network guys are probably the same. I worked with a bunch of dudes at a previous job, all networking. We're all network engineers that you just kind of gain that ability. You know, we took phone calls. We talked to a lot of people over the phone, and you know, it's surprising how many times, you know, we'd be like, "What's your network diagram? What's your topology map?" And they'd be like, "Well, we don't have one." I'd be like, "Cool, tell me how things work." And then so I would do something as simple as hop on a phone call and open up MS Paint, and I'd be like, "Cool, here's our core switch. What's connected where?" And we would just map it out together. And so you just kind of, you know, trust but verify on things like that. Like you still have to go through and use, you know, LLDP or CDP protocols like that to help figure out if things really are connected, where they're connected, because trust but verify. But, yeah, it's enjoyable. And I think it's so much easier to get a whiteboard or something like that. Yeah. And other people can kind of start, as you're drawing things out, kind of get an understanding. Even if you're not super familiar with networking, you kind of get an idea like, okay, these are how things connect. This is how they talk to each other.
It reminds me of the mind mapping.
Mind mapping?
Yeah. You know what a mind map is? Like whenever you have like your thoughts, ideas and so forth, and you just kind of like connecting them to different pieces.
Yeah, there's a term for that, right?
Mind mapping.
Mind map. But there's like it's like a specific type of chart, isn't it? Graph. I don't know. Cut this out, Todd. Yeah. I mean, it's really, that's what it is. It's how do things connect? How do your ideas connect? I mean, network is similar. You know, it's not it's not out of the the realm of
something interesting that I had never heard of before. Until I was on an incident response engagement. Can you explain what firewall on a stick is?
So firewalling on a stick would be like you have your internet connection, it goes down to a switch, like a layer 3 switch or a core switch or whatever you're doing, and then down to a firewall.
Gotcha.
And you might be saying you might have that traffic segregated to where it's, as it comes into your network, it goes through your switch, but it's just switching that traffic up. It's not doing any routing there. There's no routing happening there. It says you're on this VLAN and you're going to the firewall. And then once it's at the firewall is where the firewalling happens. So it's the reason why they call it like router on a stick or firewall on a stick is because when you draw it out on like as a diagram, it's just a stick. It's ISP switch, router, or ISP switch, firewall. And then from there, it leaves your firewall back into your internal network just on a separate VLAN, and then is allowed to go out that way. It's pretty uncommon. It's not my favorite way to set things up. Sometimes they do it just because it's easiest, or maybe they have a limited number of ports that they can utilize on a firewall or switch or something. So, but that would be firewall on a switch.
Would there ever be an instance where someone would need to manage their firewall through a VM?
Well, like through a VM? You can have VM-based firewalls.
Okay.
Yeah. You can have a firewall that is a virtual machine. It's a virtual firewall.
Okay.
It can do something like, it can be your main firewall. It can be your gateway. A lot of times when you have devices like that, you see firewall on a stick. Again, it's less common. A lot of the times you might see those VM firewalls being utilized between networks within the same environment, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it kind of varies. Managing a firewall, through a VM is kind of, I wouldn't say that's, unless the only way to manage your firewall was you put it on a, management network, and then the only way to access that management network was through a VM,
Right.
That's fine. However you guys want to manage your firewall. As long as I can't reach it from the internet, we're cool.
Gotcha.
Well, that and, keep management off your production network or guest Wi-Fi. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a guest Wi-Fi network set up on a firewall, and if you're connected to the guest Wi-Fi and you pull up the IP address of the firewall for the guest Wi-Fi, it pops right up. So, it's just, lock it down, secure it a little bit. That's all I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't believe any guest for any business organization should have access to the firewall interface.
No.
From the guest Wi-Fi.
No. You're. I would say, personally, if you don't have an out-of-band management port on that firewall by design, let's say you buy a firewall that it doesn't have, like some of the FortiGates don't have a dedicated management port.
Right.
Have your one whatever interface that you want. It has a console port. Make sure you have a console cable in case you need to get in.
Yeah.
And if you have like a DMZ port that you're not using, set that up with a specific IP to where you can hardwire in and get to a web GUI that way if you have to have a web GUI.
Gotcha.
If not, I'd say, whatever your management network is, do that. I don't recommend having management IPs configured for, corporate or production networks, just because any of your users, if that firewall is the gateway, they can do, depending on how tech savvy they are,
right.
IP config. Oh, that's a gateway. I set up my modem at home. I can do this, and can they navigate to it? Not that they'd be able to log into it, but again, it's about minimizing the attack surface.
And network segmentation would prevent pretty much majority of that, right?
Oh yeah. If your management network is completely separate from your production network, say I've got VLAN 10 as my production network, and VLAN 200 is my management network, and those aren't routed together on a switch. You're good. It's a completely segregated network. It's not even thought of.
Gotcha.
It does not communicate with anything else other than what it's managed in. So a lot of times you might see, it gets expensive because you have to have switches. You have to have a way to access that stuff. But if you have all these switches and firewalls and devices that have separate management ports, servers that very commonly have separate management ports, it's out of band, and that means that this is it's a NIC on this device that does not send or receive traffic from that other production NIC. It's completely separate. It's out of band.
Not the name NIC, just NIC.
Yeah, NIC. NIC. Yeah. So you connect all your management ports up to devices and have their own separate switches. No production traffic ever goes through those switches.
Okay.
You can. I've seen guys set it up to where they might have certain switch ports only in access mode for that particular management VLAN. And as long as you don't have SVIs on those VLANs, they're not going to route together.
Gotcha.
And so, that's another way. But it kind of depends on how deep you want to get into how you set up your management. Personally, I don't know. Is there a best practice to it? Yeah, but honestly, can you reach it? Do you have a backup plan in case you can't reach it? Because that's kind of the problems we've run into in the past, too.
So, it sounds like from everything that you've shared, right? Especially from this conversation, is firewalls are gatekeepers. Pretty much they gatekeep the network in terms of traffic flowing in or out.
Absolutely.
It's best practice to have a dedicated person to manage and monitor those firewalls in terms of the logs. If a business or organization can afford it, also integrate the firewall with a SIM tool to ingest logs, especially to kind of like automate the notification and alert processing.
Especially if you don't have someone that's monitoring them.
Right.
I've probably said this already. It just kind of blows my mind how many times we've been in an IR and we've seen that this could have been identified and stopped if someone was watching the logs.
Right.
Because the logs are in there, and I've seen it to where we've had customers that have syslog, but no one goes and checks the syslog. It's no one is proactively looking at those things.
Yeah.
It's kind of something that's set up and then gets left in hindsight when you have a valuable tool right there.
Yeah.
And I understand it. Like, who's going to pay someone to sit and look at logs or look at a firewall all day? No one.
Yeah. But also ensuring that the logs are actually being collected from the firewall.
Right, yeah. And that's, we talked about that in the beginning is, the misconfigurations there or missed configurations, I think, again, that's why, like, the capabilities of a lot of SIMs out there are fantastic for that. Because if I'm managing a firewall, personally coming in and saying, hey, I'm responsible for this, configuring it, I'm doing software updates, I'm doing patching, I'm reconfiguring rules, I'm auditing. Auditing rules are super important.
Yeah.
And I'm looking through logs, I'm going to have it set up for a daily report, and I'm going to request specifically that we have SIM ingestion on it, so that if something weird comes through, I at least get an email like, hey, you just got this connection from Russia that, it looks like it brute force something, but it got through. Like, again, if it's not hitting a rule that says, hey, this is a security event, it's just allowed traffic. That's not weird to the firewall.
Right.
But
to a SIM, it would pick up on it.
Right. Yeah. You may be able to say, like, hey, this is a malicious IP. Firewall probably can't go and look at that IP and say, oh, this is malicious. Maybe some of the new next generation firewall stuff will have that capability, but for the most part, you just block IP. It's literally just asking you to tell it what's allowed or not.
Right.
And so if you tell it everything's allowed, then cool. It's just going to let everything through.
I mean, it's just like a computer. You give it instructions, it does what it's told.
That's all it is. It's just a fancy computer that controls the flow of traffic. That's it. That's all, I mean, you can get... There's a lot of other things you can do with them now with the next generation firewall stuff, but for the most part, the bare bones of it is it just controls the flow of traffic.
Gotcha.
What's allowed, what's not. It can get as granular as when is it allowed? What time frames is this type of traffic allowed? So,
what I'm curious to know, especially since firewall networking is pretty much your domain, you provide like management and monitoring of firewalls here and there.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the fanciest features that you've noticed within your 7 years of experience that make you say, ooh?
Oh, man. Boy, that's a tough one. I really appreciate a lot of the FortiGate stuff, that all their next generation firewall stuff for their IDS system, IPS, all their like built-in antivirus stuff. It's especially helpful, like the web filter and DNS stuff.
Right.
It's not that it's anything new. It's the way that they've packaged it to where it's like, hey, here's a bunch of default settings. Also, you can go through and like pick out categories that are already pre-built. And I know there's a bunch of firewalls that do that now too.
Right.
I'm trying to think of what other types of functionalities.
I can also see how just those features alone could make a network engineer's life a lot easier.
And I think that's for me, from my perspective coming in, is like I really enjoy things that improve quality of life for like someone who manages a firewall. Like, cool, I don't have to go through here and create an access group for every single IP that belongs to Russia and then create a group on that. It's going to take hours and hours and hours to do that. And then you try to get AI or some kind of tool to do it and then, hope it's accurate.
Right.
While you can rely on the product that you got and say, hey, here's a script, create this group and just upload it and it, works. Or, you've got a predefined, a lot of them, like Palos, have predefined. It's already in there. You just the geographic areas are, this is a country.
It's built in the firmware.
Right, yeah. And so I'm trying to think of what else. The Fort extenders are pretty cool. Having a backup like a wireless option in case, your main line goes down is pretty cool, or just kind of fails over to that.
Gotcha.
Palos do a lot of cool stuff all the time. They're truly enterprise level firewalls.
Gotcha.
A lot of those ones are just heavy hitters. There's a lot of functionality. You can get really granular with things.
If someone couldn't afford, because when it comes to enterprise level firewalls, they can get pretty pricey.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, any enterprise level hardware can. Yeah.
Yeah. For someone who just wants to maybe implement or deploy a firewall in their home, but they can't afford an enterprise level firewall, what would be your go-to?
For just getting into it, probably one of the cheaper, maybe the smaller FortiGates. The 40Fs, I don't know when the 40Fs are going to be end of life. Yeah, it's going to be pretty soon, within the next couple of years, I believe. Could be wrong, don't quote me on it. I'm sure you could find some used ones off of eBay or, I don't know, whatever, someone's selling a used one somewhere. But something as simple as that, which would probably be pretty inexpensive for most people wanting to set up some kind of home lab.
Yeah.
Would give you plenty.
So FortiGate 40F, you said?
Yeah, like a 40F or 40E. Trying to think if there's any smaller ones. There are probably some smaller ones out there, but I would stick with something that has a few more ports to, like they have some older 4-port ones, but I would say like a 40F, you can find one within a pretty decent price range. I haven't looked in a long time, so honestly I couldn't tell you, but when it comes to like user friendliness, like FortiGates are pretty good there. They're nice. Easy. Their UI is really, it's easy to navigate. It's user friendly. You can jump into the CLI right from it. There's a lot of good functionality things to like about them.
Nice.
Personal opinion.
Gotcha.
I agree with you. Don't at me.
I like FortiGates.
Yeah, they're good.
Anything else you want to add, man? We covered a lot.
Oh, have we? How long have we been doing this? Oh, holy snap. It's like an hour. Gross. That lasted a lot longer than I thought it would. Went by quick. No, firewalls. They're a thing.
They are, indeed.
Use them, manage them, update them.
And if they reach their end of life, upgrade them.
Yeah.
If you can.
Yeah, replace them. Hopefully you have a good vendor that'll maybe do a step-up program for you. Won't leave you hanging.
Yeah. Also, look into management. SIM solutions that can ingest logs that way.
So I cannot recommend that enough, is having a SIM solution ingest those firewall. I cannot recommend it enough. Especially if you're someone that has to sit and manage them all day. That is your thing. You manage firewalls.
Yeah.
Nice.
This is another episode of Secure AF. I'm Keelan Knox.
I'm Andrew Hickman.
Deuces.
Thanks for your time. Bye.